coming up on The Cost of Living.
So Lizzie McGee's original game was pretty much the opposite of what we think of when we think of Monopoly today. It was meant to teach people about the evils of Monopoly.
Who is Lizzie McGee? She invented Monopoly. But life, like Monopoly, can be cutthroat. And she didn't pass go or collect her $200. Hi, I'm Paul Haberstrud. Welcome to The Cost of Living. Put up your hand if you've ever thrown the race car at your brother's head. All of us? Okay, good. Not just me. Monopoly, that childhood celebration of capitalism, doesn't always bring out our best selves. But that's not how the game started. Later in the show, the true story of Monopoly. Also today, for a hot second, new tools like Slack and Zoom were supposed to help work-life balance. But now, they're part of something called the Great Exhaustion. Up first, to get a mortgage, you used to sign a few forms and bang, bang, boom, they'd give you the money. Now, you're almost drowned in paperwork. And the reason isn't all because of you. Canadians take out tens of thousands of new mortgages every year. And every one of them now comes with a pile of signing, scanning, and screenshotting of documents. Ellis Cho, it didn't used to be this way.
Nope, it didn't. Kern Patel found that out recently when he went to get a mortgage. He was asked for 2 pieces of ID, 3 pay stubs, proof of citizenship, 3 months of bank statements. They pretty much put him through the ringer.
It's kind of stressful, because the thing is they keep on asking more questions, where you get this money from, or how you get it, where it is sitting, and even if you submit bank statement, then they are asking, do you have additional statement up till today?
It took weeks to get it all together, and then he got rejected. So he had to apply to another bank and go through the whole process all over again.
So that's not fun for him to have to do, but we're talking about a lot of money here. Mortgages are hundreds of thousands of dollars, and getting one probably shouldn't be as easy as going through a drive-thru.
True, but it didn't used to be this onerous. Ron Butler has been a mortgage broker for nearly 30 years. When he started out, he says you only needed 6 to 9 documents to get a mortgage. Today, it's way more than that, and you'll have to answer a lot of questions about where your down payment comes from.
So every single penny of it needs to be accounted for. So where did this $2,000 came from? Well, this is from me selling a computer, a whole computer setup, or me selling some vintage sports memorabilia, whatever the case. They'll actually ask for receipts.
So all these receipts, all this extra documentation is because
banks are keeping an eye out for signs of money laundering. Over the years, the federal government has brought in a bunch of anti-money laundering legislation, and banks have to follow a set of rules known as KYC.
KYC, know your customer.
Exactly. Gary Clement is a former RCMP officer who specialized in organized crime. He's currently the chief anti-money laundering officer for Versa Bank. And he says banks, if they know their customers, are in a good position to spot fishy transactions. Say you've got a client who's a police officer.
If all of a sudden they're out buying Porsches and new homes and boats and, taking all kinds of trips, there's something not right.
This is like a Harvey Keitel movie, Dirty Cop buying Porsches. Okay, but as for money laundering proper then, how big of an issue is this in Canada?
Well, the experts I spoke to say it's really hard to pin down. It's not like criminals post their earnings, right? But according to the Cullen Commission, that public inquiry that looked at money laundering in BC a few years ago, it estimated money laundering activity in Canada was worth more than $46 billion in 2018.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot.
It's a lot. Canada's become a popular place to launder money. There are a couple of reasons for this. We're a stable democracy, and the banking system is open and very accessible.
Unfortunately, we've become known as sort of a dumping ground or a go-to destination for transnational organized crime. And mainly that's because we've got so many gaps in our enforcement mechanisms that we've been seen as a very weak link.
And the point is, Canada doesn't want to be a weak link. So we're trying to tighten things up. And if you're someone, you're out there, you want to get a mortgage, you are part of that tightening.
Yes, and a lot of money is laundered in real estate. Michelle Gallant is a law professor at the University of Manitoba who studies this. She says real estate is a safe investment in places like Canada.
If you had money to invest, where would you put it? So the same investment decisions that drive anyone, even if your money is derived from anything, those mobilize and drive a criminal. Why wouldn't they?
If you look back at the Cullen Commission, it estimated that almost 5% of the value of real estate transactions in BC came from money being laundered. It also estimated that money laundering pushed real estate prices up by about 5%.
Huh.
Christian Luprecht is a poli-sci professor at the Royal Military College, and he edited a book recently called Dirty Money. He says money laundering can push house prices higher in a couple of ways. For one, criminals flip houses.
The other is that real estate is simply being bought and sits there as a way for criminals to park their illicit gains. That is real estate that Canadians could be buying, Canadians could be occupying, Canadians could be owning, that we have essentially abrogated to transnational criminal actors.
So he's talking about like big condo towers just sitting empty. If you're in Vancouver, they call them ghost towers.
Exactly. BC brought in a vacancy tax to crack down on this, and Toronto did the same. Michelle says it's having some effect, but what's a 2% tax to a drug dealer who's dealing with millions of dollars?
Right, like there's a ton of money just rolling around in all of this.
Yeah, and a lot of that money flows through the banks. Now, the Canadian Bankers Association says banks in Canada take the fight against money laundering very seriously. But recently, we have started to see FINTRAC cracking down in a way they haven't before. FINTRAC being Canada's financial crimes watchdog. It recently fined banks for the first time in its history. CIBC was dinged $1.3 million. RBC was fined $7.5 million, both for violating anti-money laundering laws.
Okay, $7.5 million is a fine, but in the scheme of a bank, it's not all that much.
No, according to Christian Luprecht, $7 million is peanuts.
If you look at the bonus that the CEO of RBC received, that amounts to about 49% of the bonus of the CEO. So there are no financial incentives, nor are there any legal, legislative, criminal incentives for banks or other financial institutions in the country to do any better.
We could see an even bigger penalty. A few days ago, FINTRAC fined TD $9 million for violating anti-money laundering laws. But the U.S. Department of Justice is also investigating TD, and there are reports that the bank could be fined as much as $1 billion.
Okay, so that is real money, and banks look like they are starting to feel some heat.
They are, but experts say that every part of the real estate transaction needs to be looked at, including realtors and lawyers. You can't buy or sell real estate without a lawyer, but
a bank has to report suspicious financial activity. A lawyer does not.
Law professor Michelle Gallant again says that's something that could be changed.
So the screws are starting to tighten here, maybe even eventually on the lawyers. And so if you're someone, you're out there, you just want to buy a house, where does this all come out in the wash for you?
Well, things are going to take longer to process and maybe even cost you more. And not just when you go to the bank. Come October, mortgage brokers will also have to follow the same rules as banks, which means more scrutiny, more paperwork.
And if you're someone looking to get a mortgage, you better learn how to take those screenshots. Thanks, Ellis.
You're welcome.
On your radio and by podcast, this is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. Everyone has one of those weeks when work just grinds you down, What you need is to unplug. But unplugging is harder than ever. So a tired week can turn into a tired month, and a month into who knows. Our producer Jennifer Keane says there's now a name for this feeling. The Great Exhaustion.
Sabrina Royal spent years working for one of Canada's big banks. She worked her way up from entry-level job to manager. And that's when her hours started getting out of hand.
When it was good, I was working 8 a.m. to about 6:30 p.m. When it was bad, there were times when I was signing off at midnight or later.
Lots of days she'd skip breaks, eat lunch at her desk. She felt anxious and tired.
I was having a very, very hard time falling asleep because I was only thinking about work. And eventually I started to recognize like this brain fog.
A classic case of burnout. The staffing agency Robert Half regularly surveys Canadian professionals. A year ago, about a third of the people they polled said they felt burned out. Now, it's more than 40%. And you know who's feeling it the most?
Millennials. These are people born sort of 1980, 1994. They were the ones coming back at over 50% saying that they felt burnt out.
Michael French works for Robert Half.
They're most likely to be the ones juggling a new family and maybe have a partner and taking on more debt and living together. So you can see why they have a lot of pressures on this cohort.
That includes the cost of living. For many, wages aren't keeping up with inflation. And that's leading to a growing sense of, what am I doing here?
In my vast experience, I have not seen it at this level in the past.
Janet Candido is an HR consultant who works with employers.
I'm personally dealing with clients where more and more and more employees are coming up and saying they are exhausted. They're burning out. They're mentally fatigued.
So what's going on? Well, Janet blames our 24/7 work culture.
We have instant messaging apps like Slack. People are phoning you, they want something right away. More the digital communication is taking over the workday. So I sometimes will spend my entire day answering emails that are coming in, which means I have to work in the evening to get the work done.
It can be even worse, she says, for people who work from home. When this happens, you better answer, or someone might think you're not on the job. And there's another thing. Right now, companies are struggling to find talent. They're taking longer to hire. That leaves people like Sabrina Royal picking up the slack.
There was no relief on deadlines. There was no, okay, you know, we're just going to scrap this whole thing because we clearly don't have the capacity for it. It was just the work has to get done. So when I had no team, that was me. And if my team was feeling overwhelmed, then that was me.
But not anymore. Sabrina quit the bank and went to work at a board game cafe. And yeah, the money's not as good, but
it's a delight. My coworkers are fantastic. The regular customers are fantastic. They really, like, my heart grows 3 sizes every day.
For the Cost of Living, I'm Jennifer Keane.
Do you remember the He-Man movie, Masters of the Universe, starring Dolph Lundgren, 1987? It was maybe the first movie based on a toy, but it wasn't the last. From Transformers to Barbie, Hollywood now loves toys. Margot Robbie, hot off of Barbie, wants to make a movie about Monopoly. We all know the game. Who hasn't had an angry sibling try to bean them with the thimble? But how well do we really know Monopoly? Because the true story doesn't stop at Boardwalk. Mary Pilon is a journalist, filmmaker, and author of The Monopolists: Obsession, Fury, and the Scandal Behind the World's Favorite Board Game. Hi, Mary.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. So, Mary, let's start here. And this is just as someone who always desperately wanted to beat his brother at Monopoly. Do you have an optimal Monopoly strategy?
Yes and no. My strategy generally is to try and buy the properties between jail and free parking. They tend to get landed on the most, and you can build them up with less cash. And I also really try to negotiate early on. I think Monopoly is a lot more fun when there's more deal making, and it's to your advantage to try and get a Monopoly as soon as possible.
Well, you have literally written the book on Monopoly, and in that book, you trace the history of the game. So what is Monopoly's official origin story, like the one Parker Brothers would tell?
Sure. So the version of Monopoly's origin story that was tucked into my family's game box and countless others was that this man, Charles Darrow, invented the game during the Great Depression. Like many Americans, he was struggling, and he goes into his basement and he innovates. And Monopoly becomes this massive bestseller, and it saves him and Parker Brothers from the brink of destruction. The problem with that story is it's not exactly true.
Why not?
So the truth about Monopoly winds the clock back way further. It starts with a woman named Lizzie McGee, and she received a patent for her game called the Landlord's Game in 1904. This game was played by a who's who of left-wing Americans from, when she received her patent all the way to the mid-1930s. So the game had a huge life prior to Parker Brothers or Darrow ever being a part of it.
Now, what did this game at the time say, the Landlord's Game? What did it say about life at the turn of the 20th century?
So Lizzie McGee's original game was pretty much the opposite of what we think of when we think of Monopoly today. It was meant to teach people about the evils of Monopoly. And Lizzie McGee was one of many people kind of questioning this accumulation of wealth that was happening in the United States, and a lot of questions about how that should be distributed, how that should be taxed. So she innovates and she creates a game, and she decides that a game is a great way to teach people. She was a really fascinating woman. She had worn a lot of hats in her own life. She had been a stenographer. She had been an actress. She had written poetry and short stories. And she was also a game designer.
Okay, so then how did Charles Darrow end up getting credit for inventing Monopoly? Like, how did he end up stealing what was her game?
So the short version is that Lizzie McGee's game, it spreads. We don't really know how much she was aware of how much it had spread and among whom, but we do know that Darrow plays a version of this game. When she creates her Landlord's Game, there's two rule sets, a monopolist rule set and an anti-monopolist rule set. And it's that monopolist rule set that really takes off as a folk game. And it's a version of that game that Darrow plays and sells to Parker Brothers. And Darrow becomes part of the marketing. He becomes part of the story. And people love the Darrow story. They love the Cinderella rags to riches, Horatio Alger tale. So he becomes tied in with the marketing of Monopoly. And it isn't long before people start to write to Parker Brothers. And they say, this man didn't invent this game. I played it with my family in the 20s and the teens, long before. But the real trouble begins when Lizzie McGee, who in the mid-1930s was working as a receptionist in Washington, D.C., she lashes out. And she calls two reporters, one from the Washington Evening Star and one from the Washington Post. And she says, I invented this game. And she shows her patents. There's pictures of her, hoisting up her game boards and describing that she was on this long before. And Parker Brothers engages in this deal with her to sell her game for $500. But Parker Brothers also promises to publish two more of her games. And at first she's elated. She thinks, wow, my Georgist ideas are going to get out there. Parker Brothers is going to give me credit for my game. This is incredible. But the problem is there's no evidence that they did that. To this day, Hasbro, who's the parent company that has acquired Parker Brothers, still hasn't really acknowledged Lizzie McGee as the inventor, even though the historical evidence at this point, I would argue, is quite overwhelming.
So she gets cut out of history, basically, and gets cut out of the credit for this game. How did her story eventually come to light?
That's a great question. The way that Lizzie McGee's story came to light is wild. There was a gentleman named Ralph Anspach, who I spent a lot of time interviewing. He was an economist living in the Bay Area in the 1970s. And he tried to create a game called Anti-Monopoly, which was kind of a more philosophically pleasing version of the game. He, like a lot of parents, he had 2 young boys, was like, you know what, I don't know if I actually like the values that Monopoly is teaching my kids, right? And there's a lot of zero-sum thinking in there. There's a lot of aggression. And so he makes Anti-Monopoly, and he gets a cease and desist from Parker Brothers. I think most of us, if we got a scary legal letter, would think, oh gosh, maybe I should back off. But that's not who Ralph is. He is a total fighter. And that kicks off this 10-year-long legal battle that ends at the steps of the Supreme Court. And he wins the right to talk about Lizzie's story. So what's tricky about that is by the time I showed up in 2009 to all this, I didn't know who Lizzie McGee was. She was still really, really obscure. And when I reached out to Ralph on a whim, he immediately got back to me and he was like, I waited 30, 40 years for someone to ask me about this. It's all a lie. It's not true. And so the book came out in 2015. I still have people who come up to me and say, oh, Monopoly, right. That was invented by a guy during the Great Depression, right? So I think it says a lot about how corporate legends and corporate myths, they stick. And it's really hard to correct the record.
Well, and that this story has a life of its own and that it is spread around the world, it speaks to not just Monopoly's popularity, but the fact that we've all played Monopoly and we all know Monopoly. So when you step back and look at it, what do you think, what is the appeal of Monopoly?
That's a great question. I think that board games are fantasy. We get to pretend to be rich. I'm the youngest in my family. And I remember when I was a kid playing Monopoly, I was like, oh, I actually have a shot at beating my older brother at something. He's so much bigger than I am. I was never going to, beat him in a fight or anything like that. So I think it gives us a way to explore these ideas and it's fun. It's for me as a kid, I remember also it's like you get to kind of be an adult. And it's funny because you think of real estate not being interesting to a kid, but I think it is like this, you get this sense of power and it brings us together. Board games, what I couldn't have predicted is that ironically, because of the internet, board games are having this amazing renaissance right now. And I think especially during the pandemic, you saw a lot of families who were like, wow, this is such a cool way to spend time with people away from our screens. Last thing I'll say is I spend most of my time in the world of sports. And if you really want to learn something about someone and the relationship to competition, play a board game with them. You see these sides of people you think you know in a totally different light. And so I think that's part of why we keep going back to Monopoly is we learn different things about our own personalities and the people that we think we know.
Well, then what does Monopoly tell us about competition?
That's a great question. I've always wondered, when I look at Lizzie's game, right, and going back to this idea, she had the anti-monopolist rule set, which you're breaking things apart, and the monopolist rule set, which is supposed to teach us to be horrible, right? Like in the real life, the real world doesn't look like Monopoly. Like I personally don't believe that I have to clobber all of my friends to be successful. I think the pie of success is large and many, many people can have slices of it. So it does teach some things about the economy that are very questionable. But I think it's interesting when you go back to this idea that these people who were very progressive, who were very left-leaning, when they were offered, this option, do you want to play the evil game or the good one? We all went towards the evil one, and that's the one that has stuck and is still with us today.
So then do you think Monopoly as we know it today, is a critique of capitalism or is it a celebration of capitalism?
It's funny, when I first came to this story, one of the big stories we were covering at the Journal at the time was Occupy Wall Street. And it was so interesting when I was going to the park and seeing all the demonstrations that the Mr. Monopoly character and a lot of iconography from the game was being embraced by people who are criticizing Wall Street. So I think there's a case to be made that, yes, like the game symbolizes, fat cat capitalism and has kind of become this interesting shorthand, but we still play it. Right? Like we still play it, even though on some level we know that isn't totally how capitalism works. So I love that it's complex. And I love that like any work of art, and I do believe that board games are works of art, just like paintings, songs, books, that it's open to interpretation and that people can get so many different things out of it.
So Margot Robbie has a Monopoly movie in the works. Your book has been optioned for a Monopoly movie. What's going to happen? I mean, could we see an oligopoly here? Could we see multiple Monopoly movies at the same time?
If sports reporting has taught me anything, it's never predict the outcome. I have no idea. I'm not a fortune teller. I have no idea what the future holds. Everything about my life, including this book and the reception it's received, has been a total surprise. So I would dare to say it's almost like a game of Monopoly itself. We don't know the outcome, but that's also part of why it's exciting.
Well, roll the dice, see where we land.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for all this.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Mary Pilon is a journalist, filmmaker, and the author of The Monopolists, Obsession, Fury, and the Scandal Behind the World's Favorite Board Game. That's all for this week. And we also have a question and answer show coming up soon. So, what are you curious about? Like, not, do you wonder why do bad things happen to good people, but more, businessy type curiosities. In the past, you've asked everything from why a nice bottle of vino that comes all the way from France can be cheaper than wine made here at home, to, is Canada's federal debt really a worry? So, what's on your mind? Give us a call and let us know. Our number is 1-866-550-COST. That's 1-866-550-2678. Or email costofliving@cbc.ca. That's all for this week. The Cost of Living is based in Calgary. And here's something kind of new. You can now listen to us on YouTube. Just go to the CBC News page, scroll down a bit, and boom, there we are. It's like magic. The internet's wow. The show is produced by Danielle Nerman, Ellis Cho, and Jennifer Keene, with help from Caroline Ferris. Our executive producer is Tracy Johnson. I'm Paul Habersrud. Thanks for listening.